Hey guys, you're listening to episode 141 of the Finish Line podcast, where we discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. My name is Keelan, and I'm here with my co-host and brother Cody. Today we're talking to John Hanger, founder of BiblioNexus. John is a serial entrepreneur and passionate giver who found himself deeply called into Bible translation. After supporting the movement financially for several years, John felt the need to get his hands dirty with what he knows best, launching a tech startup. BiblioNexus is a nonprofit tech company with the culture of a Silicon Valley startup that is making waves in the Bible translation space. You won't want to miss all John had to share. Before we get started, I just want to ask one big favor of you guys. If you've been listening to the show for some time and want to support what we're doing, the very best way you can do that is to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Just write whatever you like about the show and you'll help others find us. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the show so you're the first to know when new episodes come out. And with that, let's get started. All right, we're here today with John Hanger. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you guys. I'm really honored to follow in the footsteps of some amazing previous guests and truly impressed by the work that you two have done in building out this ministry while holding down full-time day jobs as well.
Well, it's been a lot of fun along the way. So why don't you just kick us off telling us a little bit about yourself, maybe some of your earlier years, including some of your faith background?
Yeah, sure. Born and raised in Missoula, Montana, maybe one of the first or few Montanans you've known because there's not that many of us. But I was number 4 out of 5 kids in a mixed family. My father was a World War II veteran from the Navy and spent his career working at the post office. So that's a little bit about my family. My parents identified as Christians, but they weren't churchgoers. So I didn't grow up going to church. But fortunately for me, I had a childhood friend named Billy Mayhew, shout out to Billy, who invited me to go to Sunday school and church with him at roughly age 11. And for the next couple of years, my parents were supportive, and the Mayhew family would pick me up each Sunday, take me to church with them. And I heard the gospel. And roughly 2 years into that, I clearly knew what I needed to do. And I walked down the aisle and I accepted Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. Praise the Lord. So that was obviously a big turning point in my life. I then finished high school there in Missoula, and kind of a long story behind this, but I ended up going to get an engineering degree from Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology in Terre Haute, Indiana, roughly 1,800 miles away from home. And that was obviously the next big step in life for me.
John, tell us about your early career. How did this path that God had you on from a young age influence how you thought about how you wanted to spend the rest of your life?
Yeah, well, my first job out of college was with a large consulting firm now known as Accenture, at that point known as Arthur Andersen and later Andersen Consulting. The reason I went to work there, even though I graduated with an electrical engineering degree and a minor in physics and applied optics, is I didn't want to do hardcore engineering and physics. I had worked a summer internship the prior summer, and in reflecting back, I really got that degree to please my parents. They didn't go to college. They really wanted a son who went to a good school, a top school, who got a degree that led to a quote unquote real job. So when I got to that point in life, I had job offers to do that sort of work that paid a lot more than the consulting job offer I eventually took. But I just didn't feel like that was what I wanted to do. And maybe in retrospect, it was a way of saying that to my parents because it's not like I had a passion for consulting either. But I moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where I knew absolutely nobody, taking a job with Accenture. I went through sort of their standard consultant boot camp, learning the basic set of tools and processes and so on that was common. And that's where things got a little more interesting, though, because just in retrospect, it was clearly God's plan. But I got assigned to a number of projects that ultimately led to being assigned to a very unique project where Accenture was building an enterprise software product, like packaged software. And that was not their core business. Packaged software was still a fairly new thing at that point. But at the ripe and super experienced age of something like 23 or 24, I was a leader on the team that built this product and brought it to market, first in the US. And then I spent a year living in Europe as we rolled out the product to Europe. And through that experience, I uncovered my professional passion, which I discovered was building and launching new software products. Now, as I mentioned, it was unusual for Accenture to do that. It was more common for startups to do that. So soon thereafter, after about 6 years at Accenture, I left to join the first software startup in my career, not as a founder, but as like employee 4 or 5. And 6 startups and 30 plus years later, here we are. Just one other comment to your question about God's plan. I mean, clearly this was all part of God's plan, but in all honesty, I wasn't walking closely with him during this era. Like many kids, I suppose, who go off to college, I had drifted away, in part because my roots were still fairly shallow, given my family upbringing and situation. Not to use as an excuse, but, I think about Galatians 1:10, for am I now seeking the favor of people or of God? And at that point in my life, 100%, I was seeking the favor of people and trying to build my own career success. And that was my focus, sadly.
Some of these early stories are becoming some of my favorite parts of these interviews because we know what you do now. We know how a lot of the story has played out and all the crazy stuff God is doing. But your 25-year-old self didn't know that, right? And you're just going one step at a time. And I think about how many people are listening to this right now and are in one of those earlier stages. Maybe they've kind of drifted for a season and they're just kind of going about their career. Maybe their career took an unexpected turn and they're just trying to go with the flow or whatever. But God knows how it all plays out. And he's putting all these pieces together constantly. And it's so encouraging to me to just see that even when we are totally unaware of the plan that he has, that he is very active and moving in our lives when we don't see it at all. And then you look back 10, 20, 30 years, and you can finally start to see the pieces. He's just so far ahead of us. And even now, things that we think are going now or maybe irrelevant in our lives right now end up becoming so central 10 years from now or whatever. So anyway, you were talking about drifting, focusing on career for a season, and obviously very integrated into a lot of Great Commission kind of work now. Where did God start to reintegrate you in and to draw you closer?
Well, yeah, I appreciate you asking that question so I can not dwell too long at the sad part of the story. But in 1995, I married my wife, Jennifer. We had met in Cleveland, but by then I had been transferred here to Atlanta. She moved here to Atlanta after we were married. And together we've raised 4 kids, the oldest of which is now 27, hard to believe. And then the other 3 are 24. So yes, they're triplets. And I mentioned this because this actually ties into the answer to your story. Shortly after having the triplets, I found out what it really means when it said that God's relentless in his pursuit of those he's chosen. I went for a haircut, and the lady that was cutting my hair at that point, regular in there, and we knew each other. And she knew that we just had triplet babies. And she said, John, you're not going to believe this, but earlier today, a woman who was just a walk-in here came in, and I had an open chair and I cut her hair. And as I was talking to her, she shared that she just within the last couple months also had triplets. And believe it or not, she also has a 2.5-year-old daughter, just like you guys do. And I just can't help but think that maybe I'm meant to introduce you. I didn't want to say anything to her, but I'm saying something to you. If you and Jennifer are interested in her name, I'd be happy to provide it. So I went home, talked to Jennifer. Jennifer's like, that'd be amazing. We connected with this woman and her husband, and they became great friends. And we raised our families together. And along the way, they invited us to come to church with them. And God used that invitation to bring us back and to really redirect our lives, recommitted to Christ. So, as I referenced earlier, every time I tell the story, it's a little bit emotional, but it's the parable of the leaving the 99 to go after the one, right? And Luke 15:4-6, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one lost sheep until he finds it? That's pretty much the story here for me. God was relentless in his pursuit of me, even though I certainly didn't deserve it. And he used the circumstances that we were in with the newborn triplets to bring Jennifer and I into a close relationship with him, which we've enjoyed every day since.
John, I love that story and how it represents what Keelan was just talking about, these moments of, I'm going to get my hair cut today. You never would have expected everything that came afterwards, from the woman cutting your hair saying, you know what, I got to say something. This is too much of a coincidence. How did that start to transform your lives, your outlook, and especially the way that you thought about money and generosity?
So we need to fast forward a little bit on the timeline a little bit. You can imagine with 4 kids under 2.5 years old, there was a period there where we didn't have a lot of financial margin, period. But in the ensuing years, I started to have some startup success, which introduced financial success. Not anything crazy, but Jennifer and I became generous givers. I would say, consistent with the sort of finish line math that you guys introduced on your website. We didn't have the benefit of such great tools as you've provided people now, but conceptually, that's sort of the process we went through. And we were supporting a number of ministries in a regular, but in dollar terms, relatively small way. But then in 2014, 9.5 years after co-founding a company called Contact at Once, which was my 5th startup, I was the CEO, and we sold the company for $75 million.
Wow.
So that year, we entered a new territory, and we went from sort of finish line math to feeling a new weight, honestly. We really felt the weight of the blessings that we'd received. And, we focused on verses like Matthew 6:19-21. Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven. And I know you guys reference that verse probably a lot, but like I said, that weighed very heavily on us. So we got connected with the National Christian Foundation here in Atlanta. A gentleman who leads that has become a very close friend, Boyd Bailey. And Boyd helped us get donor advised fund set up. He also helped us in thinking about giving plan. And we ultimately settled on a theme for that giving plan, which was evangelism, based on Matthew 28:19. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So with that as our theme, we selected a fair number of ministries that we provided regular support for, monthly support for. But we set out with the goal of finding one ministry where we could really move the needle with the size of our gift and where we were particularly moved to support that particular ministry. And Boyd helped us in that. And the way he helped us is he called me up one morning and said, "Hey, John, you got time to spend a morning with me?" And, working, I'm CEO of a company, and it was not exactly an easy thing to do, but I just felt like, okay, Boyd wouldn't be calling me if it wasn't something important. So Boyd picked me up and took me to hear a presentation by a ministry called Renew Outreach, which is located here in Greater Atlanta. And I got to hear the story of David and Stephanie Pulaski, their founders, and how Renew was born and what they were doing with essentially electronic gadgets for missionaries, including projectors and MP3 players and all sorts of cool things that missionaries use to take the gospel to all parts of the globe. And we were just really moved. And so we became gospel patrons, and we've been working with Renew for probably the last decade. in that capacity. I also helped David, with part of his technology advisory group, and just love those people. They love back on us. And that was a really cool God arranged connection. And we continue to support Renew and a host of other ministries today. But 2014 was a big turning point.
That's awesome. And we had the opportunity to have the Pileskis back on episode 67 for anyone that wants to do a deeper dive on Renew Outreach and the really cool stuff that they are doing to advance the gospel today. So I want to take one step back for a second. Actually, there's a bunch of things I would love to go into deeper detail on, but one thing that stands out is you talked about this big windfall and then getting really clear as a family on what your core focus would be as really a problem area or focus area, and then picked a few ministries, especially at the capacity that you guys were looking at, spreading over a couple ministries in that focused area, but then walking really closely and deeply with those ministries, and especially with Renew, over a long period of time. And I'd love to hear why you guys came to that approach, which I think is an extremely wise and helpful approach, and how that really amplified what you guys were able to do through generosity by having a focused area and then going really deep with the ministry partners that you chose to walk beside.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's any magic. I think it came out of a lot of prayer. I mentioned we felt the weight of the situation, and that put us on our knees, and we prayed a lot about it. And then, as I mentioned, God used National Christian Foundation, NCF, and Boyd and his team to provide practical input and ultimately introductions and so on. That was all part of how God orchestrated it. There was one other thing I should mention to you that also was really cool. I didn't think to mention it earlier, but Boyd and his NCF team also facilitated something that we felt led to do. At the time, they said we were the first ones, at least in the Atlanta context for NCF, who'd wanted to do this. And I think it created a few headaches for them in terms of their systems and processes, but they worked with us, and we're so thankful for it. Our oldest was in high school, and the triplets were middle schoolers at the time. And we wanted to raise them and just make it really visible that they needed to be generous too, and they needed to see that. We didn't want to hide it from them or make it an adult thing. And so what we asked NCF to do, and they ultimately were able to facilitate for us, is in addition to setting up our main donor advised fund, they set up one for each of the 4 children. And each year since then, we transfer a relatively small amount, say a couple $1,000s, from our account into each of the kids' accounts, and then give them the opportunity to think about, gee, I have this money. I can't go spend it on things I want to spend it on myself. It has to be given to an NCF approved charity. Who would I want to give it to? What causes are important to me? And it's been great to watch the kids go through the process of embracing that, learning about it, thinking about it. And some of them have done better than others, but I think all of them have benefited from that, and really appreciate NCF and the team in helping us get that set up.
I think there's a real significance to modeling the things that we want other people, especially children who are paying really close attention all the time. But I think about myself and all the things that I've learned from my parents that have deeply impacted how I pursue my career, even in my house, the things that I know how to do or don't yet know how to do. When I stumble across a problem, I'm usually still calling my dad saying, hey, I know you know how to fix this. Can you help me out? And that just has endured. But those lessons that you invited your kids into, you went through those headaches and took those steps to not just tell them about what you're doing, but empower them to make decisions and learn those habits from a young age. I think that is really, really good advice for anyone who wants to transfer values in that way to their children. John, you are involved in the Bible translation community heavily today. How did that start? Where were those seeds planted in your life?
Yeah. So get ready. This is kind of another crazy part of the journey for Jennifer and I. Fast forward to 2020 in the middle of the COVID era, my sixth and most recent software company called Car360 had been sold to Carvana in 2018. And I was still happily working at Carvana. And my wife, Jennifer, had been diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer a year prior in 2019. And then in 2020, she experienced a really rapid decline in her health. There was some debilitating symptoms. And in response, I didn't have really a choice. I left Carvana to care for her full time. Thankfully, the Lord provided Jennifer with relief from the debilitating symptoms. She regained mobility, and she's not free from cancer. She was and still is living with terminal cancer. But at least in terms of her day-to-day activities and mobility, it returned pretty much to normal. So that freed up some time for me. And it was right about then when I got a text from an acquaintance, somebody who I had known because our kids went to high school together and because he's a neighbor here in the same subdivision, but I'd never really gotten to know him. His name is Todd Peterson, another one of your former guests, believe it or not. And Todd, as you guys know, but the other listeners may not, is a former NFL kicker who's now and has been for years very passionate about Bible translation. And probably like most American Christians, we're sitting down over coffee, getting to know each other better. He's sharing with me about this thing called Bible poverty and telling me about how, there's 7,000 plus heart languages in the world and not even half of them have a Bible. And I'm like, what? That's crazy. I had no idea. I knew the Bible was the most translated book in the history of the world by far. There's not even a close second. But I had no idea that there was still Bible poverty. So God used that coffee with Todd to start a process through which he ultimately just broke my heart. So the first thing that Jennifer and I did was we joined the Illuminations community and made Illuminations the halo of our giving plan. Additive, we didn't take others off the list. We just moved Illuminations to the top of the list. And then from there, I began what I would describe as a self-directed deep dive into the Bible translation space. Like I said, I couldn't hardly believe it. So I just needed to get in there and understand it, my entrepreneurial nature or whatever, maybe my engineering nature, but I just wanted to understand what the current status was and why it was the way it was and what the challenges were, what the opportunities were. So I spent about a year and a half going to conferences, meeting with anybody that would meet with me and talk with me, learning everything I could. And through that process, I just felt God calling me to do more than just send payments out of my donor advised fund. He was calling me to get dirt under my fingernails and actually get in and do something. And I'm not even bilingual. I'm certainly not a linguist. So I couldn't contribute in that way. But as I was doing this deep dive, I had observed that technology could and should be playing a huge role in accelerating Bible translation. So I just felt called to jump in there. And the way I jumped in is by doing what I knew how to do well, which is build and launch software products. And I knew I didn't know enough about Bible translation to do that on my own. So instead, I decided to focus on building a company, hiring a team of top talent from the entrepreneurial software world, creating a culture just like a software company that I would have in a true startup, but then partnering with Bible translation organizations to combine their expertise in Bible translation with our technology backgrounds and experience to hopefully move the needle and build some solutions that could accelerate Bible translation.
I was just smiling as you were sharing some of that inception story, because having gotten to know Todd a little bit more over the last couple of years, it is hard to have any kind of an extended conversation with Todd and not become deeply passionate about Bible translation. That's obviously had a big impact on your life. And also just thinking about the crazy circumstances of how God lined up the timing of that. Because, if you had had that conversation with a random neighbor maybe a year or two earlier, it could have been a totally different conversation. But God knew exactly what he was doing, and however he prompted Todd to reach out or whatever, God knew what his plans were. So I just love seeing his such better plans than we make on our own.
Absolutely.
So, we've had the fortune to have a lot of Bible translation organizations on the podcast over time. So we've gotten to dive in a little bit into Bible translation, how some of that process looks like on the ground and stuff. From the point where you knew you wanted to step in with software solutions, what were some of the early problems that you were able to identify and say, I think this can be really accelerated with a well-designed software package?
Well, as I mentioned, even though I did that deep dive, I don't pretend to know enough about Bible translation to say, here's the specific problems that the software needs to solve. It was really a matter of finding Bible translation organizations to partner with who could bring that experience and knowledge and then collaborate with them and do what we knew how to do. So there's a lot of different Bible translation organizations, but the first one that we partnered with is called the E10 Innovation Lab. And E10 is short for Every Tribe, Every Nation. It's an alliance of the 11 major Bible translation agencies. So as an alliance, what they do impacts essentially all of the Bible translation ecosystem. And E10 created the Innovation Lab a number of years ago in the belief that this lab could go out in front of all the other agencies and their respective teams, which it isn't to imply that each of the agencies isn't also innovative. They are. But this Innovation Lab, let's say, is even more innovative and even more out in front. And they're our first partner. So they're the ones who went out and looked at all the problems, looked at all the opportunities, sorted them out, prioritized them, came up with kind of the top 4 things that they felt could really accelerate Bible translation, and then pulled us in to help with one of those in particular. And to really describe the problems we're solving and the products we build, I first need to maybe provide a little context. Historically, Bible translation was really best thought of as a production process. There was a methodology to it. It involved bringing in a Western translation consultant, typically an American or a Brit, who was an expert on the Bible, who knew theology, who knew linguistics, who was like this really specialized, super talented person. And the goal was, through this methodology, to produce a printed Bible. Makes sense, right? That process has worked over the years, but it often takes up to 50 years to produce a full Bible. So when you think about it, there's improvements to be made in that, but there's probably a point of no return. And so it really requires like a complete rethink, not just incremental improvements. And that's what the E10 Innovation Lab is doing. I would describe their new approach, their innovative approach, their let's start over approach as being focused around global church ownership rather than Western translation consultants. So really not just involving the global church, but actually making the global church responsible for the translation work, leveraging trade languages as gateways to the heart languages. So unlike here in America, where most of us don't even speak 2 languages, the global church, most of the people speak more, at least 2 languages, oftentimes more than 2 languages, one of which is a trade language or a gateway language. So if you can leverage that gateway language, you can ultimately accelerate production of a Bible in their heart language. There's an emphasis in this new methodology on oral learning. So historically, it was about reading text. The new emphasis is on oral learning because that's the nature of most of the people who don't yet have a Bible in their heart language. They're oral learners. And last but not least, is an integration of discipleship and translation. Historically, these two things were separate or linear. So there was a production process that resulted in a printed Bible, and then there was an engagement process to get people reading and using the Bible. But that's the old way. The new way is, even as a book is being translated, people doing the translation, global church members, have to understand the Bible before they can effectively translate it. So it's sort of this circular discipleship translation, discipleship translation, discipleship translation, and it creates a flywheel. And that's really a key concept in this new approach. So that's sort of a super high level description of these new approaches. But the key point is there's no software or technology to support it. There is software to support the old methodologies, but there isn't any to support the new methodologies. And so we're working with the Innovation Lab to start building products to support this new approach. And the first two products that we've built and that exist today are called the Bible Aquifer and the Bible Well. For those listeners who want to, really geek out and learn more, each has its own website, aquifer.bible and well.bible. But at a high level, the Aquifer is a cloud-based digital library accessible via APIs that contains biblical resources such as study notes, exegetical guides, maps, images, videos, all interlinked with scripture passages. So, in other words, it's the kind of resources that we as Americans take for granted, right? Because we can open our study Bible and we've got all those things, or many of them, right there in our study Bible. But if you're not an English speaker, believe it or not, even if you're lucky enough to have a Bible, you don't have any of these resources. So for literally any language other than English, these resources are non-existent historically. So what we're doing with the Aquifer is we're building software that'll essentially make this library available to software developers worldwide to build into their apps. But we also have to fill the Aquifer, not just build the software, but we have to fill it with content. So we are simultaneously building the software and filling it with content by curating the best English content out there and then translating all of that content into the 25 gateway languages that we've identified as the most impactful and most widely spoken. So that's the Aquifer. And then the Bible Well app is a browser-based mobile app. So anybody wanting to try it can do so from their phone. It is available in a variety of gateway languages, going back to that theme. And it's intended for use globally to enable both discipleship and Bible translation, leveraging the resources available via the Aquifer, but presenting them in a user interface that is intended to be easy for folks to use regardless of what gateway language they're in, and useful for both discipleship and translation.
So, John, this is BiblioNexus that you're describing, the software development.
Those are the product names. BiblioNexus is the company name. Aquifer and Bible Well are the product names. Yeah.
So catch me up on how you went from this conversation with Todd to getting involved to actually building a team to develop these resources. How did you recruit other people to get involved alongside you?
Well, it's not that interesting of a story. It's kind of straightforward. I mean, I felt called to do it. I met with a number of folks about getting funding, obviously set up as a nonprofit, requires funding. Jennifer and I are obviously in this from a financial perspective, but we had a budget of north of $5 million last year. So, this isn't the sort of thing where you can knock on a couple of your neighbors' doors and be off and running. So mainly through E10, which has through Illuminations, a fundraising organization, and the Innovation Lab, we were able to vision cast and talk about what BiblioNexus could be, match it up with what they perceive to be an important need. And then as a result of that, secure funding contingent upon my ability to recruit and build a team. And then, as you might expect, God just absolutely blessed that. And so I was way easier than ever before in my career. I was able to build a team. We're currently a team of 14 and, just some real top talent, the kind of talent that probably typically isn't going to work for a Bible translation organization, but we've got the sort of culture that's going to attract and retain software top talent. And then on the content side, similarly, we were able to attract 4 folks from a major company that provides Bible study software who had a background in licensing, securing content for that product. So that greatly accelerated things as well. So net it all out. God did it, not me. I just sort of extended the offers and took the phone calls, but God bless us with a great team and has just shown great favor towards BiblioNexus from that initial calling.
So I'm curious, now that you guys have been in this software development space for a little while, how have you been able to see some of the results, some of how things are getting to be used, and how have further partnerships developed? How do you see things continuing to grow outwards from this kind of central nucleus that you guys started with?
Yeah. Well, let me start at a high level, and then I'll drill into some specific details on Aquifer and BibleWell. But as I mentioned, we're initially partnering with the Innovation Lab on these 2 products. We anticipate and expect and hope and pray that we'll be able to take on additional software products. We know the lab's going to have some initial needs for more products, but ultimately, we'd love to work with other Bible translation organizations as well to support them. So over time, our vision would be that we'd be working on many different products with many different organizations as partners. To go back to Aquifer and BibleWell, it's been about 1.5 years since I launched BiblioNexus, and we have both products in production. Aquifer's being used extensively. You can imagine sort of an up and to the right chart that shows the usage. It's been taking off pretty dramatically in terms of the number of parties calling the APIs, as well as the sheer volume of API calls. And then for BibleWell, we can track a lot more with it because we're actually seeing the end users using it on their phone. And the number of countries in which the BibleWell is currently being used is north of 60. And honestly, we don't even have all the gateway languages built out yet. It's still very much a work in process. So we're super encouraged by the early success. On the BibleWell website at well.bible, you can see a video that was filmed in Africa where a number of the users describe some specific success stories where they've been using BibleWell to accelerate their Bible translation efforts, and even one where there's a story from one of our African partners about some Muslim folks who are using the BibleWell and have learned a ton about Jesus, even though they're not Christians yet. They're learning about Jesus and reflecting on stories about Jesus. And so a lot of cool stories. That video is a great number of them.
So maybe you can give us a little bit more of kind of a nuts and bolts, specifically about BibleWell. You talked about integrating this flywheel of discipleship and translation. What does that look like in software form? And how do you encourage both of those angles and facilitate both of those in the end user?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So I mentioned there was the old methodology, right, which was more of a production process. The new methodology is almost more like a Bible study. And then once the local church members are confident in their understanding of the Bible, then they progress to translate it. And they work what's called a pericope at a time. For those not familiar with the term pericope, it's just like a passage. Like if you think about your Bible, there'll be a subheading that talks about what happens over the next 12 verses. Think of that as a pericope, right? So it's kind of a story. So they'll take a pericope at a time. And in the BibleWell, one of the pieces of content we have is like an exegetical commentary that is the methodology. And it says, okay, let's start with this pericope, listen to it. Again, oral learners, listen to it. And we have not just the textual Bibles, but we have audio Bibles in the BibleWell. So from their phone, they click play, they listen to the passage multiple times. And then having listened to it as a group, they act it out. So they'll use things on the table, or they'll put on costumes even in some cases, but they act it out. It's all part of making sure that they really understand what's happening in that passage. And then the last part of it is they articulate it. So they'll use their phones or some sort of recording device, and in their heart language, they will say or translate what they've been acting out and listening to in the gateway language. And voila, you now have the first draft of that passage in the heart language. So you take that and you rinse and repeat that pericope by pericope by pericope, and you ultimately have a Bible recorded in the heart language. I'm greatly oversimplifying it. There's obviously quality assurance and review steps and things of that nature, but in an approval process, right, it doesn't involve necessarily a Western translation consultant, but does involve scripture review boards and sort of an infrastructure to ensure the trustworthiness of the Bible that's produced. But at the end of the day, it's really that simple. That's the flywheel, right? It's study the Bible, understand the Bible, and then articulate it. The specific methodology is called FIA, which is familiarize, internalize, and articulate. So that's what drives it.
John, we're seeing every day new applications of how AI is making things more efficient, more powerful. How have you seen AI take a role in everything that you're working on?
So yeah, AI's the big topic of the day, not just in Bible translation, but generally. And in the Aquifer product, we use AI extensively. As I mentioned earlier, we're not just building the Aquifer software product, we're also filling the Aquifer with content. And once we have English content identified, we then need to translate that content into these gateway languages. And AI is awesome for accelerating this, because we're talking about and we're dealing with gateway languages, and AI's strength is translating into gateway languages, the major languages of the world, right? The reason for that, by the way, is AI, the I part, the intelligence part, comes from training, right? So the system has to be trained. And the way that you train AI systems is you feed them data. For example, if you have human translated copies of a single document or a single book in two different languages, you feed that to the system, and now it has a pretty good idea how to translate between those two languages. If you feed it 10 books, it's even better. If you feed it 1,000 books, now it really knows how to do translation. So the major languages of the world, of course, there's a lot more training material, and AI is really good at it. When you get into the other languages, let's say the languages that don't yet have a Bible, most of those are minor languages, and many of them have no data. So AI is less helpful, and in some cases useless, for actual Bible translation. You had a guest on just recently from the Seed Company who talked about how they've done some innovative things, and there's lots of innovation happening with AI, but it's not the straightforward translation type stuff that maybe some people think because of those small languages. However, in our world, the way that the Aquifer works is AI does the first draft. So let's say we're working on a study note from Tyndale related to a particular Bible passage. We click a button, it translates it from English into a gateway language, let's say French or Spanish. We then have a human reviewer. We've built in a workflow process where a human reviewer looks at that translation, because we're not quite ready to trust AI fully. Okay. It's really good, but it's not perfect. So we insist on a human review process. The human reviews the output, makes an edit if necessary, or approves it if it's perfect. And that is built into the workflow, as I said, to ensure trustworthiness. But we've found that AI, in the context of Aquifer content, translated into the gateway languages, has been a huge, huge accelerator. I think last year we translated well over 3 million words, and that pace is just accelerating. Yeah, so it's playing a big role in our world. We're kind of a straightforward AI user. We're not doing crazy stuff that nobody's ever done with AI. We're using it in a very straightforward way, but we're using it in a big way.
So how much difference does all this content make in speeding up the translation of some of these more fringe languages? Having more context and stuff like that. How does that play into the actual translation process for, a brand new language of a relatively small people group? And I'd also like to know, this is really kind of a separate question, but how did you guys manage to get all of this English content? Because I know that's probably coming from all kinds of different copyrights and places all over the place. What has that process looked like to funnel that into one central, pretty freely accessible library?
Well, if I may, I'll take those in reverse order. In terms of the content curation, between my content team and the innovation lab, we have a team of experts who've dealt with this content for years in different contexts, so they know what's out there. You hit the nail on the head in terms of the real key is finding content that is openly licensed, right? There's always copyrights, but there's different licensing that can restrict how you use it, that can impose fees, et cetera, and it can get very messy very quickly. And it does, frankly, not just with biblical resources, but with the Bibles themselves. So what we've said under the Innovation Lab's leadership is we're dealing only with open licensed content. And many of the largest publishers out there of Christian content have embraced this through God's grace. So example, Tyndale, a well-known publishing house, specifically took their study notes and their Bible dictionary from a tightly held license to an open license that allowed us to put those into the aquifer and begin translating them. There are other examples as well. SIL, which is part of or related to Wycliffe, they have a set of translators' notes, which you could think of as sort of the accumulated knowledge of all these teams that have done all these translations over the years. And that was previously tightly held and not shared even with other Bible translation agencies. But SIL recently openly licensed that content, and that's now in the aquifer. And I can just keep going. There's so much great content, and God's moving people to release their content into an openly licensed environment, knowing that the aquifer's there, and there's now a mechanism through which that content can actually get used worldwide. To come back to the AI piece, the bottom line on AI is it's absolutely playing a role today and will play an increasingly big role in Bible translation. But what it's not is it's not a silver bullet. Like I've talked to some people who are like, oh, we should be able to just throw the English Bible into this large language model and out should pop whatever language we want. But as I mentioned earlier, for the languages that are missing the Bible, AI is less and less useful. And to the extent that it is useful, it requires really novel uses of it, like really innovative uses of it. The seed company example where they further trained a large language model using an existing human translated New Testament in order to train the model in hopes that it would provide a first draft of the Old Testament. And they're having some success with that. That's a really novel and sophisticated approach. And undoubtedly, there will be teams uncovering new, novel, and innovative approaches that will be helpful like that. But as I said earlier, at the end of the day, it's not a silver bullet that's just going to magically solve the translation problem for Bibles.
Well, John, there are all access goals established for the Bible translation community to hit some pretty lofty goals by 2033. From your perspective, what needs to happen for us to see this become a reality?
Yeah. So for those not familiar, the E10 all access goals in a nutshell say that we want to have at least some scripture available in all heart languages, all 7,000 plus heart languages by 2033. It's a lot more involved, and there's a lot of details for anybody who's interested, but that's kind of the high level summary. So how do we get there? Well, E10 is tracking progress of everybody who's doing Bible translation, all these different organizations. It's all centralized now in one tracking. And when E10 first started, a decade ago, it had to be through prayer that they came up with 2033 because the data would have shown that it was going to be hundreds of years before those all access goals were reached. But they set a really aggressive goal of 2033 and just said, God, provide the innovation, provide that we're trusting you. And 2033 is the date. Since then, the projected date that the data shows has come in, but we're still off by, I don't remember the exact numbers, but let's say 50 years. So over the next 8 or 9 years, we need to find the innovations. We need to get products like Aquifer and BibleWell rolled out, new products that, maybe we'll have a chance to work on this year. But these technology moves that allow the new methods and the new processes to scale globally and empower the global church. And even as the Western translation consultants are still doing what they're doing, we need that too. But we need to empower the global church with these new tools. And that's going to be the key to getting there. And that's a pretty good reason to wake up every morning as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, amen to that. So I got to ask, as an engineer and an entrepreneur, you just see the world in a different way than a lot of people. And as you look at this God-size problem to tackle, but, also breaking it down into the smaller chunks of tackleable problems, where do you see the role of software being used in ways that it is not yet being used? Where do you see the opportunities on the horizon? If you had a team of 100 people, where would you start deploying those personnel and resources right away?
Yeah, I think just in terms of general themes, the first word that comes to mind is mobile phones. Okay, that's 2 words. But, it's amazing. Only 40% of the world's population lives near or has access to a power grid, but 96% of the world's population has access to a mobile phone. Mind blowing, right? So the mobile phone is a key technology that's already out there. It's being used, and little to none of the Bible translation related software products work on a mobile phone today. The BibleWell app is one of only a few examples. So we need to get apps that facilitate the processes that we've talked about today, that empower the global church. And we need to get the apps and the content in these gateway languages onto mobile phones. That's really, at the end of the day, probably the more important foundational technology than AI. Not that AI isn't important, but we just need to get more software available on mobile devices. And that's going to be a key.
Well, John, as we get to the end of our time together, we want to leave some time for our Manager's Minute, which is a practical action that our listeners can take to step into their role as stewards and to manage God's wealth wisely. John, do you have a suggestion for our listeners today?
Yes, actually, I have a couple, if that's all right. First, I'd just like to challenge the listeners to pray about and be open to getting dirt under your fingernails, in addition to financially supporting ministries. One specific idea for that's near and dear to me is becoming a BiblioNexus community reviewer, which is what we call our bilingual partners that review AI translations of biblical resources. If you are bilingual and have even modest knowledge of the Bible, you can be a great help. My team provides training on the software and processes, and then you just work as and when available from your home computer to help move things forward. In terms of investing your God-given financial resources, I'd ask that you please consider BiblioNexus or Illuminations. BiblioNexus, if you agree that software is like a big lever that delivers outsized impact and you want to increase the size of the lever that we currently have, or Illuminations, if you just want to support Bible translation generally. As I said earlier, Bible poverty broke my heart, and I hope that it breaks the heart of many of the listeners as well. And these are just a couple ways that you can individually have a positive impact as we try to eradicate Bible poverty.
Yeah, and John, if somebody wants to get involved either in helping with some of the translation, if they have some language experience, or in just learning more about BiblioNexus, where can they find out about you guys?
Yeah, for anybody interested in helping with the community review process, approving the AI translations, there's a community review section in the aquifer.bible website. So that'd be the place to gather information and to express interest in participating. For those just interested in connecting with me or with BiblioNexus generally, BiblioNexus.org is our website. And my email, if you want to contact me directly, is john.hanger, Hanger, at BiblioNexus.org.
All right. And I encourage everybody to check out BiblioNexus and all the awesome stuff that John and the rest of the team have going on. John, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for sharing your heart, what is just exploding in the Bible translation world right now. And I'm excited to see what God does even over the next year. It seems like every year the whole story is changing in what God is doing. So thanks for giving us just a peek into your world today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Keelan and Cody, for the opportunity.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show, guys. If you want to find any references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 141. Before we finish up, I have a quick question for you. Have you ever stopped to answer the question, how much is enough? A financial finish line is designed to help you do just that. Our 90-day Finish Line Pledge breaks down the process into 3 easy steps. Step 1, define how much is enough for you and your family to spend in a single month, and use that as your monthly spending budget for 90 days. Step 2, as God provides money to manage, set aside any margin outside of your finish line into a separate bank account. Step 3, after 90 days, explore the many ways you can use the margin you've set aside to create joy, purpose, and impact in God's kingdom. Want to learn more? Check out our website at finishlinepledge.com. That's all we have for today. We'll see you next time.